also wanted to thank the Architecture League, among other people, but it's been actually really exciting to be part of this this whole project. Both an honor to be a part of this group of people thinking about this stuff, but also I wanted to thank them in particular for sponsoring our Sentient City exhibit, which I think I've told some of you guys involved individually, but that was a collaboration between my practice in lab and Natalie's practice in lab, and we always saw it as an experiment to start something, to test out a possible future for the rivers of New York, and it is in fact leading to a much larger construction, so it's a great example, and I just want to thank you guys publicly for helping to make that possible. But what I wanted to talk about here, in the context that Omar framed, super interesting context for thinking about this stuff, what I wanted to do is basically offer two examples of data and design that are related to both my teaching and my practice. And the first one is not particularly related to situated technologies, but it very much engages the idea of kind of computation and data for design exploration. And more specifically, it basically involves a workflow that I've used with students at Columbia in the Master of Architecture program, where students can use systems for geometric modeling, which they're certainly already familiar with, but they can connect that to evolutionary computation techniques and basically create geometric models that can be evolved over time according to goals that they can set. So in this case, you see a very simple example just for demonstration. There are 3 circles and then a shape, a solid object made between the 3 circles. There are 6 inputs, a radius and an offset for each circle. And then you can set up a series of objectives. In this case, just for the sake of example, we're saying let's find the solid shape with the largest volume, the least surface area. We know the answer to the problem is a sphere. The computer over time tries to explore the design space of all possible objects and tries to get closer and closer to results. It doesn't know anything about the concept of a sphere, but nevertheless it searches for possibilities that satisfy the constraints. And this, just for the sake of showing the example, shows that in the first generation, the sampling of designs looks fairly random, and by the end, the computer's honing in on this thing that we know of as a sphere. And the students have obviously used that for much more complex design problems that approximate some of the complexity of architecture itself. So both more complex geometry, more complex objectives such as aesthetics, program, site, and then a range of performance measurements that starts to be a bridge to really important data in our built environment, and that involves a kind of digital simulation which maybe could be thought of as like projective data. So you can take a certain permutation of the design, subject it to structural analysis in the computer, predict how it would perform, and then use the computer and that prediction to help evolve possible designs. The idea basically is that this design process, which is often used in a very engineering type of way, to hone in on very specific performance metrics and what can sometimes be summarized as a trend in performance-driven design. It could also be flipped on its head and used for exploration, for creativity, to discover things you might not already know about a certain design space. So what kind of design problems are good for this type of experimental process? Well, this was something created by one of my students to explain that whereas maybe we already know the answer of a sphere in the example I was describing earlier, but if you have a simple diagram of 5 different towers starting off on the ground in different points, and there are about 17 different ways in which these 5 starting locations could connect. Well, if you only have 1 floor, then there's 17 design possibilities. But if you have 10 floors, by this point you have literally more design permutations than one could possibly compute, even if you had hundreds of computers, and even if they were 100 times as fast as the one today. So this is the start of a good design problem to solve with this technique. and related to starting to understand data. So, this is now going to be a series of charts that my students have created in order to understand data in their design process. This is a simple chart of just a histogram, meaning on the x-axis is time or designs over time. On the y-axis is the measurement of displacement. The goal is to get a lower score, and you see a trend over time. The design's getting a lower and lower score, although there's quite a bit of variation. This is an example where each black dot represents a design permutation. There are over 25,000 design permutations generated automatically by the computer. And then you can ask the computer to solve for the set of best designs according to the design criteria, which in this case were to minimize the amount of structural problems and also minimize the amount of material. But an interesting teaching point for me is that once you use this computer process, you're in the computer, you're in the realm of supposedly objective data, but nevertheless, the best the computer can do for you is solve for a set of possible designs, not a single possible design. So it's a really interesting way to engage, something that Laura's brought up and it's been present throughout the day, which is a combination of quantitative and qualitative. Even though using the computer very heavily here, using quantitative data, there still have to be qualitative judgments made about which point you select from the set of blue points here. This is a chart created by a student which uses an interesting feature of the software which allows you to visualize in 4D. And this is interesting because many problems set up by the students involve many more than 4 dimensions, but 4 dimensions is about the limit of the amount you can visualize at one single time. Here you're visualizing by x and y axis, also by color of circle. Each circle, again, is a design iteration, and by size of circle. This chart is called a parallel coordinates chart, where each design is a line, a zigzagging line, instead of a dot. And you can see how the designs perform on a series of parallel axes. These are techniques from statistics. You can generate these type of charts in Excel and even in Illustrator, my students now told me, that allow you to take each design permutation and analyze it according to 5 criteria at once. So the larger the shape, the better it's scoring on all the criteria. The more symmetrical the shape, the more it's evenly scoring on all the criteria, et cetera. And then one last suggestion, that this type of problem can sometimes be visualized by imagining that you have the properties, 2 example properties on the x and the y axis, and you're making a kind of surface which indicates what the total design space would be. Some design spaces are very simple, like this plane. Some are more complex, and then often problems are very complex, especially architectural problems, where there's not a clear relationship between which way to move on the x and y axis in order to achieve the highest point on the z axis. Further visualization in order to basically prioritize among your criteria, to give certain weightings to criteria. And the last things I'll show for this example are that students have started to visually analyze, because architecture students are clearly much more visually trained and oriented than quantitatively. So this is one technique of taking some design permutations and trying to understand the difference between them visually. Students have invented this technique of taking a series of designs, which are represented by each of these black boxes here, and overlaying a large data set at a very small opacity for each one, so you get a kind of composite of all designs possible. In the early generation, one student had this kind of configuration when you overlay all possible designs. A later generation, you have this, which indicates the trend over time, but in a visual kind of probabilistic way. A similar technique here, visualizing where structural bars would go on a sample of a skyscraper, and where these programmatic boxes would start appearing. So that's been a way that I've been very interested in exploring data with students in the context of kind of typical data that we think of in our society of, like, big data. When you read the New York Times article and it says that we need 175,000 new data analysts to enter the job market next year in order to deal with the things, like what IBM calls smarter cities. So that's one way of getting students kind of familiar with the data in that type of sense. And this type of exploration has these kind of characteristics here, often associated with normal data analysis. But a second type of project that I'll explain very quickly is kind of a counterpoint for me. And one of the reasons I wanted to describe the first project is to compare it now to the second type of project. The second type is more about revealing forces in the environment rather than exploring design iterations. It's an open system. It's deliberately kind of low resolution, incomplete data. It's comparative data rather than absolute data. And really, it's trying to encourage asking questions about data. We saw some great examples of that in the last panel, rather than simply just solving problems through data. And I'll first describe how one of the projects that our practice, the Lithium, completed recently with this in mind. And it started very much with the physical environment, with constructing as well as using data. And more specifically, it started with this very bizarre effect of the physical world, where you probably recognize this type of thing because it's honey dripping into a jar. And it has a coiling effect because of the material properties of the viscous liquid. You can apply that same effect to lots of viscous liquids, including plastic, which you can heat up. It becomes a viscous liquid. And if you drop a thread of plastic instead of into a jar, but onto a conveyor belt, then you can get various patterns by varying the speed of the conveyor belt. So you can get a straight line if you're moving pretty fast. You can get a kind of wavy line if you're moving at a medium speed. And you can get even more complex patterns if you move slowly. So we're trying to imagine what kinds of constructions in the physical environment, kind of strange architectural prototypes, might we create combining data and physical construction. So in this case, we're taking the example of this kind of threaded silicone bead as a synthetic material, and we're combining it with a system of natural material, in this case, moss suspended in a liquid that is sprayed out at certain intervals here, and we can control that also through data. So we're basically trying to build up a system where we can explore the design of different forces, somewhat controlled by data, but also relating to other forces of physical construction. And the third thing we combine, if the first one is a synthetic or artificial material, the second one is a natural material, the third is what we call a material of ideas. And that just means that we're basically guiding the rate of the conveyor belt as well as the rate of spraying the moss through an aggregate of our web searches. So this is using something called Google Insights. You've probably heard of it. It's very similar to Google Trends, which is famous for being able to composite all of our web searches and predict important trends in our world. For example, an outbreak of the flu can be predicted by Google Trends quicker than it can be predicted by medical officials who monitor hospital admissions. In this case, we're basically monitoring a certain neighborhood of a city, what their web searches are for forward thinking, for terms like the future, environment, and construction. And we basically have created a kind of ecosystem that's guided by forces of vegetation, by construction, and by human imagination. This will just give you a sense of the contraption, the kind of physical contraption we created. Actually, rather than a conveyor belt, we have a rotating disc, but it serves the same function, but allows us to loop back on itself. This is melting recycled plastic that allows us to get this kind of additive construction over time. And you see how we start to layer up this construction in the physical environment, but that's being guided by a very loose comparative data set. You see it kind of from a different angle. And basically here what we're doing is putting these two forces together, the force of the synthetic material layering up over time, the force of the moss, the natural material, laying up over time. They somewhat compete with each other because the more we get the synthetic material, the less easy it is for the moss to take hold. The more the moss takes hold, the easier it is for the synthetic material to slip off, or the harder it is to gain traction. So we thought of it as a kind of a very, very rudimentary ecosystem. So taking some of the complexity of an ecosystem, stripping it down to its essential competing forces, and putting it together. And maybe most essentially, the idea was we designed all of this up front, and the idea was to let it run for the 30 days of the exhibition without intervening at all. And basically, this is a kind of time lapse of the first half of the exhibition. You see a kind of equilibrium developing, an aggregation, construction over time. But then there's a tipping point in the data, a kind of imbalance in the ecosystem, and over time, really a new but much more complex type of balance was created. Here's an analysis of the data over 30 days, which I won't really go into, but it gives you a sense of small fluctuations that might have a big effect. Just a few more images. And then the last thing that I'll just quickly show is how this translates back into the teaching, which is we've been teaching a class called Living Architecture at Columbia for several years now. About 5 or 6 years ago, this was one of the first projects called the Huggy Wall. And basically based on an infrared sensor, this wall, this construction in the physical environment, hugs you. Very compelling project at the time and still today, but very one-to-one relationship between sensors and the physical environment. And, oops, do we have sound plugged into this? Can you guys hear this on the speaker? Oh, sorry, we're done.
The aftershock came out pretty good.
So this is a project from a couple of years ago, which is basically using aggregate data rather than single one-to-one data. It's monitoring positive terms and negative terms in the ambient spoken environment and changing the lighting effect in response to that.
The aftershock was excellent. The aftershock was amazing.
And so basically that represents, I think, what's an interesting term for us in using data, not purely for engineering, quantitative, performance-based design, but more for exploration, for asking questions, for comparative scenarios. And I think that the balance between the two is going to be something that's more and more important for us to engage in architecture.